Hello everybody. Okay, so this is the little lesson that I promised you about the basic Keynesian model. So first let's start with the Keynesian assumptions without any math. So we have these three rules. First, if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, then production supervisors all through the economy notice that inventories are falling because we're producing stuff faster than we're selling it, and so it's drawing down our inventories. And in the Keynesian model, they adjust by hiring workers. Output then grows, the economy grows, and unemployment falls. Keep in mind that somebody who stands against the Keynesian model would argue that it's just as likely that prices would rise, and that's true. But in the Keynesian model, anytime something is out of equilibrium, adjustment always occurs in output. So that's the first rule. The second rule is just the opposite. If aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, then production supervisors notice that inventories are piling up because we're selling things slower than we're producing them. So inventories are piling up and they adjust by laying off workers. Output falls, the economy shrinks, and unemployment rises. And the third rule is just a special case where aggregate demand happens to exactly equal aggregate supply. And when that happens, production supervisors notice that no inventories are changing, or inventories are unchanged. They take no action. The economy is in equilibrium. So this is the equilibrium condition that's going to come back later when we solve this thing in algebra. So keep in mind, equilibrium occurs where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. Alright, so what is aggregate demand? Well, in the Keynesian model, it's separated into four components. There's personal consumption, there's business investment, there's government spending, and there's net exports. And when you add all those things together, C plus I plus G plus XN, adding them all together, you get aggregate demand. Okay, so what is aggregate supply? Well, aggregate supply is just the total value of production. You could think of it as like the horn of plenty if you wanted to, or you can think of it as some kind of typical factory producing something, or some huge place producing lots of stuff. But anyway, aggregate supply is somehow this abstraction of all the things produced in the economy somehow added up. Alright, so let's build our first model. So let's start again with aggregate demand, which was C plus I plus G plus XN. And now let's make some simplifying assumptions that kind of remove some of this stuff. Let's begin by assuming that exports and imports are equal. So if they're equal, net exports would be 0 and we can ignore it. So let's just let net exports be 0 and it disappears. Next, let's think about government spending. Can't we just all get along? So in some kind of Pollyanna world, maybe we could all get along and there wouldn't be any need for government. We wouldn't need police, we wouldn't need we wouldn't need stuff. So let government spending be 0. Just for the sake of this first very simple model, we're going to assume government spending is 0. So we drop that out. And that means that aggregate demand now is just C plus I. There is no G, there is no net exports. Alright? Then it would be that, so I did that. Aggregate demand is C plus I. Now let's build the two components of aggregate demand. First, the consumption function. Okay, so the consumption function in real life probably looks something like that. That it has a positive intercept, it rises, but it begins to fade as incomes get really, really high. But in the simple Keynesian model, even though we know that the consumption function probably looks like that, in the simple Keynesian model, we just assume that it's linear. And it introduces a little bit of error into the model, but the error is very small if you remember that the Keynesian model is really only used to analyze small changes in income from the position where we are currently located. Even the terrible recession that we had in 2008, equilibrium income didn't move very far, not even 5%. So we're talking about small movements in income. So it's okay to think of the consumption function as linear. There's a couple of things about the consumption function that we need to identify. First, there is this thing called autonomous spending. It's where the consumption function hits on the aggregate demand axis. It's defined as the level of consumption when income is 0. Secondly, the slope of the consumption function has a name. It's called the marginal propensity to consume. So we have the consumption function. Now, if you put in this line, it has a silly name called the helping line. The helping line is just a 45-degree line that passes through the origin, and it doesn't have much of a function for the consumption function, but it comes very important later when we get to equilibrium income. So you'll see later why that's important. So we draw the helping line. Okay, so now let's go to the investment function. Now, to draw the investment function, we need to step away from Keynes for just a minute and start way back with supply and demand. So I have supply and demand over here in the corner. We have our demand curve, we have our supply curve for loanable funds. So this is the market for loanable funds. There is an equilibrium interest rate, and there's an equilibrium level of investment that will occur. So we can take that level of investment, let's just call it I0, and then we can grab it and set it up here in the investment function graph that we're going to use in the Keynesian model. So to do that, first I'm going to just erase all that title over there because it makes it cluttered. I'm going to put I0 here, and then we're just going to draw the investment function straight out from there. And the way we do this is Keynes assumes that the level of investment comes, in the simple model anyway, the level of investment comes from outside of the Keynesian model. It's determined over here in the market for investment funds, and it might be related to income, but its relationship to income is small and trivial compared to its impact from interest rates. So there we have the investment function. Now what we want to do is add the investment function and the consumption function together. So I'm just redrawing the consumption function that we had before, and now I'm going to add investment to that, and we get this new function called C plus I. So what we really did is we just took the investment that we had from the investment function and we just pushed up the consumption function by that level of investment. So this point over here was autonomous spending. From here to here is investment. So this point right here, even though I'm not going to ask you, this point would be autonomous spending plus investment. Okay, now once you do that, and remembering that we're using this very simple model where C plus I is aggregate demand, this thing, this C plus I function, maps out aggregate demand for all these different levels of income. And remember, income is just another way of measuring aggregate supply. So since this helping line was a 45-degree line, it turns out that this distance right here, which is aggregate supply, is exactly the same as this distance. Whoops, what happened to my arrow? Exactly the same as this distance right here, which is aggregate demand. So when we're at this intersection of the C plus I curve and the 45-degree line, we are at Keynesian equilibrium because aggregate demand is exactly equal to aggregate supply. Alright, so this is called Keynesian equilibrium for this model, because remember, there's no G and there's no XN. Later on this semester there'll be other things here, but for now C plus I is aggregate demand, so this would be equilibrium. Okay, so now given this kind of way of thinking about the economy, what is the Keynesian policy prescription? Well, Keynesian policy comes in because oftentimes equilibrium income will be different from full employment income. For example, let's just imagine that full employment income is over here, somewhere to the right of equilibrium income. So we have an economy operating here, but for everybody to have a job, the economy needs to be operating over here. So Keynes would say what we need to do is we need to somehow stimulate the economy to get this income to move out here to full employment, and the way to do that is to drive up aggregate demand. In this case we've driven it up by increasing investment. So see, this is I prime. If we drive up investment just enough to make the C plus I curve hit the 45-degree line directly above full employment income, will be better. So one way of thinking of that is we're going to raise up investment, let's call it delta I, by some amount, and raising that up is going to cause income to move. This is delta Y over here. Got it? So there's a formula that helps us figure this out, and it is the change in investment times the multiplier. I haven't given you the formula for the multiplier yet, but the change in investment times the multiplier gives you the change in income. And the multiplier is defined to be 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. You can just memorize that, but if you were to ask me in class, I can show you where that formula comes from. It's just a converging series, and it takes a little bit of algebra to derive it, but we can do that in class if you want. But for most of you, you probably just want to remember that the Keynesian multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so let's see, where are we? So now what we want to do is work one of these out with the math. So let's just take these givens here. Autonomous spending is going to be 150. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. Investment is 250, and full employment income is 1,500. So first, I just want to get those numbers into my picture. So I'm cleaning my picture up just a little bit. So we have 1,500 is out here. This is full employment. And then autonomous spending is 150. That's this number right here. Business investment was 250. That's this distance right here. And that means, of course, this number is going to be 250 plus 150, or 400. Right? That number is 400. And then we can calculate the multiplier. It's 1 over 1 minus MPC. MPC was 0.6. Right? So 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6 is the same as 1 divided by 0.4, and that is 2.5. If you don't see that, stop this video and work it out on your calculator. You should get that the multiplier is 2.5. Okay, so now we have equilibrium here, because equilibrium is just going to be 400 times the multiplier, gives us this number over here. So here we are at the moment at equilibrium, but where we need to be is way out here. So you can see that the economy is operating at some level short of full employment. And Keynes would say what we need to do is raise the C plus I curve up so that it intersects the 45-degree line directly above 1,500. Now we can figure out how much extra investment we need by kind of working backwards. Since these numbers over here times the multiplier give you the corresponding numbers over here, see how that works out? We can work backwards, and we can take this number 1,500, divide it by the multiplier, and that will give us this number over here of 600. So 1,500 divided by 2.5 gives us 600. And now that we know that's 600, we know that we must have raised it up by 200, because we were at 400 and we got to get it up to 600. So we're going to get $200 of extra investment, and that $200 of extra investment is going to generate $500 in extra income. You might think about how that's possible, because it's not described in the math. How did it happen that a $200 initial investment change caused a $500 change in income? And the reason is because when the government or whoever spent that $200, it caused the aggregate demand to go up, and when aggregate demand went up, inventories began to fall. So production supervisors began, I lost my mouse again, production supervisors hired some workers, which pushed them over here, which took aggregate demand up again. Production supervisors hired more workers, took aggregate demand up again, they hired more workers, and so forth. And this just goes on and on and on until finally we get to the new equilibrium where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. Alright, so I think that's everything. Oh yeah, I've created these little formulas for you. So it was delta I times K equals delta Y. That's the formula that you have. And so we knew that the change in Y we needed was 500. We knew that, right? Because we were at 1,000, we needed to get to 1,500. We knew the multiplier was 2.5. So it was really simple to kind of work backwards and figure out the change in investment we needed was 200. Now I think that's all of it. Oh yeah. Okay everybody, so I hope you found that helpful. Good luck.